Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spiritual Spruce podcast. My name is Elena, and today I have with me Eileen Rouse. In this episode, we're going to be discussing childhood abuse, trauma, and recovery. We're going to shed light on the healing process and what it was like for Eileen to trust her intuition and have faith in the spiritual guidance she was receiving. Many of us have experienced trauma at some point in our lives. Trauma is a term used to describe distressing events that may have long-lasting harmful effect on a person's physical and emotional health and well-being. Trauma can look like neglect, bullying, sexual, emotional, physical, or any form of abuse, chronic illness, death of a loved one, or any extremely distressing event or environment. Today, we're here to share Eileen's story of finding herself, healing after trauma, and trusting her intuition and discovering faith in spiritual guidance. Eileen is a certified intuitive angel guide reader and a certified InVizion coach that specializes in weight release. She has been communicating with the angelic realm her entire life and incorporates their wisdom and healing into her readings and coaching. Eileen is a self-published author and is working on her next book, Discover the True You. Eileen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yes. So walk us a little bit through your journey, and at what point did you realize that you were receiving guidance and how you trusted your intuition to begin your healing process?
So I have always had this intuitive sense, and mine started very young. When I was very young, I just kind of always had this sense and this knowledge, and I could always have sort of this sense that someone else was giving me wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't become really relevant to me until probably about the age of 10, when I moved from my hometown of El Paso, Texas to Houston, Texas. And as we had moved in, I was actually sitting outside in our new home, and I was observing the young boy across the street do basketball hoops. And as I was just sitting there and observing him and watching him, it was almost as if I just sort of zoned in on him, and I could literally feel all of this pressure, this anxiety and stress that he himself was, I guess, expressing and feeling. It just sort of felt like there was some turmoil going on at home. And I just had this overwhelming sense of sadness and depression. And I didn't realize that I was actually picking up on that until I would probably say about 2 weeks later, when I experienced the same thing, in just observing my mother and sort of picking up visions that had transpired in her life and emotions that she was currently feeling. It was a very big sense of self-worth and not feeling worthy. And I immediately got scared. Just being 10 years old and not having any idea of what that is or how you even talk about it was a little frightening to me.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I just wanted nothing to do with it. It was always there. And then when I was about 15, I remember being at home and going to sleep, and I always remembered having this tall, dark figure that would stand at the foot of my bed. And I was always terrified of this dark figure. I could never see a face. It was just always like a dark shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so terrified of it that I would sleep with a Bible. And I remember going to sleep that night and waking up the next morning having this vivid dream and this sense of calm almost, that I literally wrote down, and I journaled the entire dream. And the dream was basically where I had received a visit from Archangel Michael, who had come to me and told me, "I'm the one that stands at the foot of your bed. I've been sent here to help you through this journey, and I don't want you to be afraid." Right away, it was very clear that he could tell that I was frightened. And he said, I'm here to impart, my wisdom and my guidance to you, and you're here to help others. And I'll tell you, in all honesty, it was a very loving dream. And I listened to it, and I obviously I wrote it down, and it stuck with me. But as I continued to grow, it was just one of those things that stuff like that wasn't really in my particular upbringing. It was actually frowned upon. You didn't really mention it. You never really talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried really hard to just walk away from that. And it wasn't until I had my first traumatic experience where I was 19 on my own, living my life, and had a full-time job. And I decided that I was going to tell my family that I was in a same-sex relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it did not go over very well. My mother was raised Catholic, but then converted into Southern Baptist. And I don't have anything against religion. I feel that everyone should have their own beliefs, and I respect those beliefs. And I was really afraid of telling my family about my same-sex relationship because I was really afraid of being disowned. And that's exactly what happened. My family completely disowned me. I was on my own. I was the oldest of five. Family was very important to me. And I just didn't like being put in the position to have to choose between who I felt I was at the time and my family.
Mm-hmm.
And having gone through my worst nightmare, what I consider to be my worst nightmare, I completely fell into a very long depressive state. And I truly, at that time, had to really rely on the guidance. It was at that time when Archangel Michael and Archangel Raphael stepped in, and I could see them visually. I could hear them, and I could feel their presence with me at all times. And in those moments when I felt like I was in that pit of despair, they would step forward and tell me, you need to write, you need to write, you need to write. And so I did exactly what they said. I would sit down and I would just write. I would write, everything I was feeling and all of the emotions that I had. And in that writing, I I imparted a lot of internal wisdom, but I also sought out other aspects of spirituality. And so that led me down the path of looking at things in a very different way because I was brought up in Southern Baptist beliefs. And so I really tried to shy away from the whole spirituality and my imparted intuition and wisdom. But having gone through that journey just really helped me to be a little bit more open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I started reading things in both the Eastern religion. I started really doing my own investigation about spirituality, about intuition, about psychic abilities. And it wasn't until I met this amazing woman, and she sort of took me under her wing. And she was like, you're very gifted, you're very talented, you're an empath, you can feel other people's emotions, and you're really divinely guided, and you really need to use those to help guide you towards your journey in life. And that's pretty much when I really started listening to my guidance. And I was probably like maybe 20, 21 when I actually started listening to it, and really allowing the things that would, it's almost like when you open yourself up to something other than what you've always known, it's like all of a sudden the pieces of the puzzle start to fit together and you're like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of what led me on the journey of my intuition and listening to my guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will tell you that that was my first traumatic experience. But I think what really brought everything home for me was in all of my, I guess what you would call soul searching, in all of
Mm-hmm.
my soul searching and really looking at, like really trusting my empathic intuition that was coming through, but also really doing that deep, what I would call shadow work within myself. I always had this sense and this feeling that something just wasn't right. It was almost like as if there were parts of me that I just didn't know.
Right.
And I'll just put it in that perspective. And it was like when I would go back and I would, do my own work and I would do my journaling and everything, I realized that I had a massive memory gap. I could not remember between the ages of 5 and 10. Like the only thing I could remember was when I was 10 when we moved, and I could remember from 10 on. I could only remember up until about a certain point. And my parent, my siblings would say, well, do you remember this? Do you remember that? And I would just be completely dumbfounded. I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I don't remember that at all. And they had details of things that happened when we were someplace, and I had like no memory of it whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And you fast forward to, I'm going to say about a year ago, and I was in a very good place in my life. I felt like my life was really together. I was enjoying life. I was, doing everything that I loved. And all of a sudden, I was completely blindsided by a memory that I had no knowledge of, that I didn't even know was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I always had this sense of knowing that it's almost like when the topic of sexual abuse comes up, I would always get very uneasy. It was always like I was very uneasy with that particular topic, and I didn't want to talk about that particular topic. It was almost like I was walking on eggshells when it came to that particular topic.
Right.
Any kind of shadow work that involved that, it was just like, nope. Mm-mm. And I would just sort of like I would say, oh, that doesn't pertain to me. And I would just move on without really looking. But it's like I knew that I was uncomfortable with it. And I was a peer romance consultant who basically deals a lot with sexual health and sexual wellness.
Right.
And so we do a lot of teaching, and in that teaching is on sexual abuse and how to really educate women and how to get them to a point that they could love themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember going as a consultant. I went to training, and one of the big topics was on sexual abuse, and there was a lot of discussion with it. And I will tell you that in sitting there and listening to it, it was like I was very uncomfortable.
Right.
So fast forward 2 days after the conference, I come home. And I'm with my wife, and my wife and I are in bed, and we're having a conversation. And next thing I know, I'm literally transported to a time and place when I was young. I was in a bedroom that I I mentally did not remember, but I remembered it because I'd had dreams about it. And I was in this room, and I was literally like, I'm looking around, I could literally pinpoint every single thing in this room. And all of a sudden I could just smell the mustiness of the room itself. And I could hear the jingle of the doorknob. And as the door opened, this dark shadow, like I could see like the body, but I could not see the face. And this person came in and basically said, "Are you ready?" And I literally could feel what I felt as a child. Like I knew that I was a child,
Mm-hmm.
and I could feel everything. Like I felt the sense of dread. Felt like I just wanted to hide in this darkest barrel that I could possibly find. I felt embarrassed, and I immediately had this large sense of fear and like, oh my gosh, like this is not right. And this person got on top of me and proceeded to do what this person always did. And I remember laying there, and the first thing I said was, "Let me see your face." And it was almost like the moment I said that, I snapped out of it. And when I snapped out of it, my wife looked at me and she was like, "Eileen, are you okay?" And it was like when I saw her face, I just started to cry. Like it was almost as if I knew that I had just witnessed something that a part of me sort of intuitively knew was there, but I couldn't figure out how to get it, or I was getting to that point where I thought, am I going crazy? Um,
Mm-hmm.
After that episode, 2 days later, I had another trigger episode. And it was just like one right after it was just like all of these repressed memories that just kept flooding back to me one by one by one by one, completely knocked me on my feet. I had what you would call a breakdown. I was completely blindsided by it. But intuitively, I knew that there was something there. I still, to this day, cannot, like, I don't know who my assailant was. But there's a part of me intuitively that knows. And having to go through that experience led me down the path of truly seeking guidance, outside of not only my spiritual realm, but I had to seek a therapist and we had to do some regression therapy, which is not easy. It's not for, especially when you personally feel like you're going crazy. Because I would
Mm-hmm.
always ask myself, am I making this up? Like I would constantly, ask myself, am I making this up? Is this really real? Is this true? Because I couldn't put a face and I couldn't put a name to what was to the person. I almost felt like I have to be making this up. And
Right.
what led me was, what ended up happening was I remember sitting in a therapy session with my therapist, and she said, you should never question what you feel, because what you feel is who you are.
Mm.
And when she said that, it was almost as if it hit me in that one small moment that I thought, oh my gosh, she's so right. Because then it brought back all of the times in my own growth and in my own journey of doing my own shadow work where I was avoiding that topic altogether, because it was like I intuitively I knew, but I wanted to avoid it, because it's almost like if I don't see it, it's not there. It doesn't exist. And and so that was when I really called in, Raphael, at that point, to really help me really learn to listen to what my body was trying to tell me. Because our bodies are very good indicators of what's good for us and what's not.
Right.
And I, as an empath, we tend to carry all of our emotion in our gut. And we also carry the weight of the world in our gut.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for an empath to truly impart what is theirs and what is not theirs. And so it was a really, for me, it was really about recognizing my own voice, my own worth, and really allowing myself, I guess you could say, giving myself permission
Yeah.
to say, this is what happened and this is what I'm going to do about it. Because for years, I never wanted to go down that path. But now I'm at that path. And so, every day it's, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's completely gone, because it's not. Like every day is new. But I think what's helped me the most is I take every day as a single day,
Mm-hmm.
and every day I evaluate where I am. Because the one thing that stuck with me was you validate your emotions because that is who you are. So every day I evaluate who I am in that moment, because that's what's important to me. I have to be able to identify who I am, because a lot of times when we have repressed memories, we put ourselves back into that person and who we were.
Yeah.
And when we fall into that, is when we tend to fall out of line. So I always have to make sure that whenever I have a memory that comes back, or something that triggers me or kind of sets me off in a very weird way, I always have to call back. Okay, how am I feeling? Is this within my present? Is this within my past? And sometimes I have to ask myself, is this something I'm projecting for the future? Like, I have to bring myself back to the present and say, this is who I am.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-mm.
That was very beautifully well said. And,
You're welcome.
it is true how you said that every day is a new day, and these things don't necessarily just go away. But it is a journey, and it's definitely a commitment. It's a commitment to, if anything, to more of who you are, and focusing on your feelings and your emotions, because you know some people maybe are not very aware, or they are, but they push them down. They push down what they're feeling because
Mm-hmm.
they want to be on.
Mm-hmm.
You want
Mm-hmm.
to get up, you want to do what you're supposed to do and follow your agenda. And sometimes feeling how you feel is not really in the question for the day. There's no time for you. You know, everyone
Mm-hmm.
has to keep going. But and especially when we're younger, when something happens that's so incredibly just painful, it is very difficult for someone to integrate that into their life, to for it to be in context. It's so out of context. It's
Mm-hmm.
like just earlier today I was eating a popsicle and playing outside with my friends, and like then this dark scary nightmare becomes a part of your life. And then
Mm-hmm.
but you have to keep going, because
Yeah,
sometimes these people are caregivers, there are family members. There's no there's no way to process what has happened.
exactly.
Yeah, so it is hard. And as life goes on, it is so difficult to it's easier to in a way it's easier to push down what you feel. But like you said, once it comes up, once you have this release, and the release it could be very painful, a lot of crying, a lot of panic and questioning. But you can never go back to how you felt before, because once you have the release, it is so much more painful to push down your feelings.
Yes, exactly. I had a friend who worded it very appropriately. She said, when you have a wound, a lot of times we get so involved in life that we just put a band-aid over it.
Yeah.
But when someone comes along and rips that band-aid off, what do? We put another band-aid over it. And she's like, and this, unfortunately, is not something that you can continue to put a band-aid over.
Right.
You have to literally cut it open and heal it from the inside out. And that's
Right.
exactly what has to happen. Yeah, you're right. It's a lot easier for everyone to just stuff it. And I was very known for that. As an empath, it is so much easier for us to just stuff it and move on.
Right.
But you can't continue to do that, because then it just every emotion. And I think a lot of times as people, we tend to, especially those of us that are on the spiritual path, we tend to feel guilty for feeling something negative,
Right.
right? We feel like we always have to be happy, or that we have to be, you know, positive attitude or in a mood all the time. And we are human. We're going to have those negative emotions. And it's when those negative emotions come up, or any kind of feeling that's negative in a way, we have to evaluate it, because it's coming up for a reason. There's a purpose to it. And that's when we have to learn to um, we have to learn to go deeper, like going within the wound to
Mm-hmm.
figure out where the root is and heal it at the root in order to move forward.
Right. Yes. And that is definitely the harder route. You know, the easier route, in a more shallow sense, would be to cover it up. But at some point or time, it's going to, a lot of the times it just makes you feel sick and run down. And there could be physical manifestations like illness, or anything like that that can definitely happen, because the body is overworking itself so hard
Mm-hmm.
to protect the secret from itself. Because at the time that in a way it was a survival mechanism, like, oh my gosh, I can't process this,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no way, and if I do, without the appropriate attention or care, you know, it's just catastrophic. So, and you know, I really like the quote, that says life is not necessarily about surviving, it's about living. And I think
Yes.
for, you know, for a long time, we are just surviving, and it almost like hurts my heart to say that, because I remember those days where I was walking around feeling like a dark cloud over my head, but still smiling and still being the best person that I could be, and just feeling like I am literally giving my absolute everything, and I still didn't feel like I was receiving anything, that was helping me. I felt like I was giving, and not feeling like I was doing anything for me,
Mm-hmm.
my commitment to how I felt. So it is, it's a huge thing. You know, it's something that we do, like you said, as empaths, we take on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of questioning that goes into our memories. You know, it's like, I don't know if you know who Teal Swan is.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay. She said that, I really love what she said about this. She said that in regards to repressed memories, that when you have a memory of, let's say someone reminds you, do you remember when we went on that walk, like last Thursday or something? And you say, oh yeah, I can't believe I totally forgot about that. I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a challenging thought. That doesn't challenge your reality by remembering it. But when you have a memory that comes up and it's very challenging, it challenges who you are, how your life
Mm-hmm.
is going to be afterwards, then that's when the questioning and the doubt comes in. And
Exactly.
that questioning, in a way, and I know we've talked about this before, I mentioned that in a way it's almost like, for me, it was a little bit re-victimization of, you know, not doing it on purpose, but it's almost like the the feelings and emotions are like, am I a joke to you? You know, like,
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
it's like betraying. It almost feels like self-betrayal in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very painful to continue that process, but it eventually becomes something that you honor your feelings and your emotions. And
Mm-hmm.
it just, there's a point where it's just truth. It's just, the truth is the truth. you know, so
Mm-hmm.
that can be very challenging for some people. And it most certainly is a journey. You know, there are triggers, there are moments where you feel panic or anxiety over nothing. And it's PTSD, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing, you know, so it takes a lot of commitment. And for some people it's very life changing. You know, you might have to change careers, or, you know, and I'm not saying this to, you know, scare anyone or freak anyone out. It's not meant to be something that you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just how deep it runs in us. But meaning that it's just that much more important
Yeah.
to focus on.
Yeah, no, that's totally accurate, because when I went through this whole process, I had to give up being a peer romance consultant because I couldn't do it anymore. My passion for it had completely gone, and I had completely. I mean, this literally made me question who I was. It was almost like I couldn't identify who I was anymore. Um, And when you get triggered by repressed memories like that, you sort of lose who you are individually, because you're having to work through memories that you didn't even know were there, right? Because you sort of have already idealized who you are based off of what you've experienced. But when you are in an adult life and you're all of a sudden remembering things that you have no recollection of, and all of a sudden you get completely blindsided by something, when you're like, who am I?
Right.
And so PTSD is definitely something that I feel that everyone needs to be aware of, and you need
Hmm.
to validate where you are in your journey and validate how you feel. I mean, for me, I don't watch anything that pertains to sexual abuse, because those are triggers for me.
Right.
And I'm very careful on, sometimes certain smells can trigger me, and sometimes certain situations, when it pertains to like just certain types of situations. And I'll tell you that I have to, I things do change for me. So it's you definitely have to honor that. And because I couldn't do, being a peer romance consultant anymore. And my biggest thing that I had to work on was finding something that brought me a lot of joy.
Right.
Um, and it wasn't so much about doing something just to do something, it was doing something that brought me joy. Because for me, it was really about finding joy, finding what I loved, and incorporating that into my everyday. So, that's what led me down the path that I'm on now, as into my cooking, because that's the joy part that I had to incorporate into my own self healing.
Yeah. Yeah. It, you know, in a way, when we go through this process and we deal with, you know, what happened in the past and how we're dealing with it in the present, then there's like this point where a whole layer sheds, a whole skin sheds, and you realize that you can create your future that has nothing to do with your past. You can
Mm-hmm.
honor your feelings. Like, I really like the saying that says, feelings are like children. You know, when they come up, they just want to be like nurtured and recognized and felt and confirmed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to, you know, necessarily give in. You don't have to always, you know, ride your whole life based off of your emotions. You can observe them and love them, and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You know, like talking to yourself, like your inner child, like, I hear you, I love you. And you know, honoring that hurt person inside you. And then also being your own, in a way, being your own hero or heroine,
Mm-hmm.
and moving forward in life and saying, you know, this is my chance of doing something that I love. And, you know, I can totally resonate with that. With hard times comes the light as well. So there is definitely growth in the pain. um,
Yes.
you know, that's so important to remember, because sometimes you just feel like it's the worst thing ever, and it's very, very hard to recover, but it is not impossible. And there are ways, and there's lots of help. um, and you know, like you said, finding, just by starting with something that you love to do and embracing that. For you, it's cooking. And I think that when you find something that you love, it just, it gives you that sense of purpose, and that, almost like an intimacy with yourself, um,
Mm-hmm.
showing yourself love. So yeah, tell us a little bit about cooking and the joy that you find in that.
So cooking has sort of always been a part of my life. I have many amazing memories of being with my grandmother and cooking in the kitchen with her. She would cook everything from scratch, and I had a very special bond with her. I always felt safe with her. It was almost like she was sort of my safety net. And
Mm-hmm.
I used to love to just watch her and help her and learn from her. And after a while, as I grew up, it's just sort of, you know, when you get so busy with life, you just kind of let that go. And as I had to go through my own healing and finding something that brought me a lot of joy, it was, you know, returning back to the kitchen. And, you know, I've lost my grandmother now probably about almost 2 years ago. And when it happened, it literally knocked me on my feet. It took me a whole year to acknowledge the fact that she was gone, because I never wanted to admit it to myself.
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost like when I'm in the kitchen, one of my biggest struggles was accepting that what happened in my past happened. And it's almost like I refuse to acknowledge it. And so part of my therapy and healing for myself was being able to create a different story.
Yeah.
And so cooking for me is basically my creating. It's putting in that creativity and filling it with love, because my grandmother always, how she shared her love and her adoration for people that she was with was through her cooking. And that was something that she sort of instilled in me. And so when people come to my home, I just want to automatically feed them. I'm like, let me cook for you. Let me prepare some, because that's how I appreciate people. So I
Right.
look at my cooking now as, you know, the little bits and things that, you know, like if I'm dicing or if I'm chopping or cutting, it's me sort of taking every piece by piece. I'm working on it individually. And then as I'm putting it all together, I'm creating a masterpiece and I'm filling it with love. And so that's kind of what's ultimately helped me, just in a sense be creative by creating a new story. It's creating the newer version of me, per se. That's
Right.
kind of how I look at it. um, but it also makes me feel like I have my grandmother with me, which oftentimes the angels always tell me she's there. My kitchen is very crowded, I'll just say that. It's extremely crowded. I have a very small kitchen for everyone that likes to be around the kitchen.
Right.
but it's that for me, that's really how I look at it. I look at it as creating a masterpiece, creating a story, and filling it with love.
Hmm. Yeah. And, my kitchen is the same way. It's definitely, it looks lived in. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yes,
that's,
exactly.
and it's funny because ever since we talked, which was maybe, I don't know, it was probably maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, when we last spoke. And ever since we talked about cooking, have, I recently have got into it a little bit more than usual.
Hmm.
And, you know, I really enjoyed it. And it's mostly because I'm just trying to eat a little bit more fresh and,
Hmm.
healthier in the sense of having fresh ingredients,
Hmm.
and not doing takeout and stuff. And yeah, I can say it really does. There's a moment where you're with yourself, and it's almost like you're in a meditative state a little bit.
Hmm.
You're, talking to yourself. You're talking to the food. Like, what am I going to do with you? What's going on over here? Looking at the
Yeah.
pot, like it's a little comical experience, for
Hmm.
for me at least.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy it as well, and being able to, like you said, it's giving a piece of you to the people that you love,
Hmm.
and it's creating your own story.
Hmm.
Like, this is what happened. Yes, I accept this. I honor it. It is a part of my history. It's a part of my
Hmm.
life. But it doesn't need to be a part of my future. It has nothing to do with me. It
Hmm.
has everything to do with, you know, the other person, or culture, or, whatever, however you want to look at it. It's just something for us to honor, and, find our own joy in life.
Hmm.
Because there are times in our life where you can't control what happens. There
Yeah.
are unfortunate events. So being able to move through it, and, discover your who you really are
Yeah.
is, yeah, I mean, it's the whole purpose of our being here, and sharing it with others.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And interestingly enough, you know how the saying goes, when God hands you, lemons, make lemonade,
Yeah.
and that's kind of how I've kind of looked at it. It's interesting that when I went through my first traumatic experience, that, the one thing that the angels always told me to was write. And it wasn't until I will tell you that my book, Discover the True You, has been in the making for 10 years. And it basically encompasses everything that I went through during my first traumatic experience. And now I'm incorporating the bits and pieces that I've learned from this past year and a half to put the rest of it together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I didn't realize that, it's sort of like, when you have unexpected things that you don't plan for, right? And these things occur, right? It is entirely up to you to do what you want with it. So it's a lot in a very similar sense of cooking. You have the ingredients. You're the one that has to decide what masterpiece you're going to make from it. So it's really about looking at it in the perspective of what ingredients am I going to put into this, which then I'm going to feed to myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I've loved looking at it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at it. Well, Eileen, thank you so much for being here on the podcast. I really enjoyed having you.
Yes,
And
thank you so much.
yes, this was a wonderful experience. Everyone, I will put down all of Eileen's links down below. And I believe you have a website, correct? Do you have a coaching website, Eileen?
At this time, I don't, but my page on Facebook is Know the Light. I can send it to you.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Okay, and thank you so much again. It was lovely to have you.
Thank you so much.
And everyone, stay tuned for our next episode coming out next week. And if you have anything you want to share, you can always email us at thespiritualspruce@gmail.com. Feel free to leave a review if you love the show. And everyone, take care.